April 1944, deep in Alabama farmland. Rows of barbed wire ringed Camp Aliceville, a compound built to house 6,000 German prisoners from Rommel's Afrika Corps. Guards braced for hatred. They heard music instead. Within weeks, POWs tuned violins, staged plays, and edited a German-language newspaper, while American officers recorded compliance with the 1929 Geneva Convention, equal rations, clinics, classrooms, and soccer on Sundays. "Life is a golden cage," one inmate wrote home, a line cited by Alabama historians and preserved in museum collections that document letters, photographs, and programs from prisoner orchestras and art studios. Numbers told the larger story. By 1945, the United States held roughly 425,000 Axis prisoners in more than 500 camps. Aliceville was Alabama's largest, designed for 6,000, and managed under the Provost Marshal General's rules. The orchestras and murals were not anomalies but policy outcomes. Humane treatment, meaningful work, and cultural outlets were written into manuals, inspected by Red Cross teams, and reported by camp newspapers whose box scores tracked weekend soccer as carefully as roll call. The result, inspectors noted, was discipline without brutality and goodwill between guards and the guarded. Yet none of that captures the moment of cognitive dissonance visitors described. A guard stepping off post to steady a music stand, a chaplain lending Bach, a farm family leaving iced tea on a fence post for men who had worn the palm tree badge of the Afrika Corps. Propaganda had promised cruelty. Instead, decency arrived on a timetable, logged in daily reports, and visible in gardens, murals, and letters home. How did sworn enemies begin calling their captors fair, and sometimes friends? According to military records and oral histories, the answer starts with law, logistics, and leadership, and unfolds inside the blueprints of a purpose-built camp whose schedules, classrooms, and work details turned restraint into respect. Before the wire, before the music, there was dust and pride. The men who filled Camp Aliceville had worn the palm tree insignia of the Deutsches Afrika Corps, veterans of Rommel's lightning campaign across Libya and Egypt. In their minds, surrender was temporary. The Reich's propaganda machine had promised that no American could match German discipline or technology. Captured officers told interrogators they expected vengeance. Instead, they were shipped across the Atlantic to a landscape of red clay and magnolia trees they could barely believe was real. The Afrika campaign had forged their confidence. Under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the DK pushed British and American forces from Cyrenaica to El Agheila, routing the inexperienced U.S. II Corps at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. Rommel's staff diaries recorded pride in superior tactics and contempt for industrial armies of amateurs. Yet 3 months later, the Axis in Tunisia collapsed, 250,000 prisoners in Allied custody, more than Stalingrad's haul. German soldiers boarded Liberty ships bound for the United States, still wearing sand-stained uniforms, believing captivity a brief detour before victory returned. Interrogation summaries from North Africa reveal how deep the indoctrination ran. One sergeant insisted, "America will feed us, but never respect us." The irony would be that respect was precisely what awaited him. By August 1943, the first transports reached Alabama. The War Department's Provost Marshal General Office had planned the operation with bureaucratic precision. Every guard briefed on the 1929 Geneva Convention, every camp inspected by the International Red Cross. Letters later censored but preserved in archives captured the first cracks in certainty. "They treat us fairly," wrote one former tank mechanic. "No beatings, no hunger, only rules." That admission would travel back to Germany through rumor and family correspondence, unsettling propaganda that portrayed Americans as savages. For men who had marched behind Rommel's panzers, the shock was not defeat, it was dignity. Behind barbed wire, they would discover that the enemy's greatest weapon was not a tank or a plane, but principle. In 1943, the United States found itself the custodian of an unexpected army, hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers scattered across its own soil. The country was still mobilizing for global war, and most trained troops were already overseas. That left older reservists, National Guard veterans, and teenage recruits to guard prisoners who only months earlier had fought under the palm tree badge of Rommel's Afrika Corps. A Provost Marshal General memorandum dated June 15, 1943, admitted bluntly, personnel assigned to enemy prisoner camps are inexperienced and public confidence uncertain. Rural communities panicked. Newspaper headlines warned, Nazis in Alabama. Town meetings debated whether fences were strong enough. Yet the War Department refused to cut corners. War Department Technical Manual. TM 19500 demanded that POW rations match those of U.S. depot troops, about 3,800 calories daily, and that prisoners receive medical care equivalent in quality and frequency. This decision, unpopular with civilians enduring rationing, became the backbone of American moral strategy. At Camp Aliceville, construction delays and ration shortages tested that principle. Barracks lacked plumbing, fences sagged in summer heat. Still, the commandant, Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth L. Krebs, insisted on order through decency. His handwritten directive of October 2, 1943, preserved in National Archives records, reads, "Discipline through respect, not resentment." Guards drilled daily but also received cultural briefings explaining why humane treatment was a weapon stronger than bullets. It weakened Nazi indoctrination. The underdog wasn't just the soldier in the watchtower. It was the American system itself, balancing ideals against fear. Many guards were farmhands or mill workers drafted late. Some shared cigarettes with prisoners while standing in Alabama dust. They understood little of European politics, but knew fairness when they saw it. By winter, the camp's rhythm held. Work details, classes, orchestra rehearsals. The Germans were secure, the locals no longer afraid. America had turned scarcity into strength, proving that moral endurance could be as strategic as firepower. Beneath the ordinary routines of roll calls and work details, the U.S. military had embedded a quiet social experiment. Declassified documents from the Provost Marshal General's Office, Box 1281, reveal a program called the Special Projects Division. Its mission, to re-educate enemy prisoners through exposure to democratic ideals rather than through punishment. The idea was audacious: win minds while wars were still being fought. Camp Aliceville became one of the program's proving grounds. Inside its barbed wire perimeter stood not just barracks but classrooms, a library of more than 5,000 German language books, and an auditorium with a stage built by prisoners themselves. American cultural officers, many former professors, supervised lectures on American history and constitutional rights. Dr. Howard B. Tolley, a University of Cincinnati dean turned Army civilian specialist, wrote in his 1944 report, "We must treat education as a tool of peace, not propaganda." German intellectuals among the prisoners were encouraged to organize self-governing committees, a clause derived from Article 43 of the Geneva Convention. They managed camp newspapers, art exhibits, and music festivals that doubled as psychological rehabilitation. The camp newspaper, Der Zaunpfahl, the Fence Post, published essays debating democracy versus dictatorship. Every issue was reviewed by censors yet rarely suppressed. Its editor later said, "We learned free speech behind wire. Economic practicality supported morality. POWs filled critical labor shortages, repairing roads, harvesting crops, and maintaining local utilities under Engineer Corps supervision." Engineer Corps Report, ECR 12 and 1944, calculated more than 3.5 million man-hours of work performed without sabotage, evidence that trust, not terror, ensured productivity. For guards and prisoners alike, culture became the new battlefield. A corporal who once fought in North Africa recalled hearing Beethoven drift through the humid Alabama evening and thinking, "We don't have to fear them anymore." When Red Cross inspectors toured the camp in December 1944, they noted discipline excellent, morale high, atmosphere one of mutual respect. This strategic humanism was deliberate. The War Department saw that every gesture of fairness undermined Nazi propaganda, claiming Americans were barbarians. Education, music, and lawful labor turned captivity into demonstration. By late 1944, what began as an experiment in compliance had evolved into a model of moral warfare, an American innovation as powerful as any weapon in its arsenal. By mid-1944, Camp Aliceville ran like clockwork. Daily logs from the Provost Marshal General's office, Box 1279, show a rhythm that mirrored any small American town. Reveille at 0600, work details from 800 to 1600, evening study or recreation, lights out at 2200. Sundays brought soccer tournaments and concerts, where brass bands played both Lily Marlene and Yankee Doodle. Guards noted in their journals that routine replaced resentment. The environment itself became part of the experiment. Alabama's summer heat, temperatures topping 105 degrees, according to U.S. Signal Corps weather records, forced guards and prisoners into small acts of cooperation, sharing water, hauling shade tarps, trading humor about the unrelenting sun blurred the old dividing lines. Red Cross inspectors documented unusually cordial interaction between sentries and internees, calling Aliceville a model of discipline through dignity. Material culture reinforced the transformation. POW artists painted murals across mess hall walls, vivid Tuscan hills, Bavarian villages, scenes of home imagined through memory. Some of those murals, later restored by the Aliceville Museum, still bear penciled signatures dated July 1944. Others carved violins or crafted chess sets from scrap wood. Even local farmers noticed the change. They spoke of the Germans as the polite workers from the camp. Censored letters from the period capture an emerging paradox. One mechanic wrote, "The Americans live differently, yet they are fair. Perhaps our newspapers lied." Another told his family, "I have seen the strength of democracy in the way they treat us." For Camp Command, this was confirmation that re-education worked better through observation than lectures. Still, tension lingered under the surface. Fences and guard towers reminded everyone that friendship had limits. But by late summer, the community around Aliceville had grown accustomed to their guests, and the POWs themselves maintained order voluntarily. Then, in August, an accident shattered the fragile normalcy and revealed how deeply empathy had taken root. On the afternoon of 27 August 1944, a soccer match unfolded under the heavy Alabama sun. Prisoners shouted encouragement in German, guards leaned on rifles, and a ball arced over the boundary fence. One young soldier, Gefreiter Ernst Hoffmann, aged 23, captured at Bizerte, jogged to retrieve it. The warning whistle came too late. A sentry, startled by movement near the wire, fired a single round. According to Provost Marshal General Accident Report, Center 44A112, Hoffmann fell instantly, the bullet piercing his chest. The camp froze. It could have erupted into chaos. Instead, something unexpected happened. German NCOs requested permission for a funeral in accordance with our faith and military custom. Captain George G. Riley, the American officer of the day, approved. On 29th August, under Red Cross supervision, the prisoners carried Hoffmann's coffin, built by camp carpenters, through the gates. The choir sang Ich hat einen Kameraden, a song banned by Hitler's censors but allowed here. American soldiers removed their caps. Photographs from the Aliceville Museum's 1944 7 series show both flags, the stars and stripes and the Reichskriegsflagge, draped in solemn symmetry above the grave. The effect rippled far beyond the camp. War Department telegrams circulated the story as an example of discipline through respect. Within weeks, Other camps, including Tonkawa, Oklahoma, and Hereford, Texas, adopted similar gestures of mutual decency. Aliceville established a memorial committee to maintain Hoffman's grave, which the town of Aliceville still tends today. The funeral became a psychological turning point. Reports from the Red Cross inspection team of September 1944 recorded no hostile sentiment following the accident, only shared grief. Guards noted that work details resumed without incident. Productivity even increased. German officers later told interrogators they had witnessed the humanity of the American character. Hoffman's death reached newspapers indirectly through local rumor, and for many citizens it changed perception. What had begun as fear of enemy invaders turned into respect for young men far from home, now mourned by both sides of the wire. By winter, Aliceville's orchestra performed for visiting U.S. officers, dedicating a concert to our fallen comrade Ernst Hoffmann. In the camp diary, Commandant Lieutenant-Colonel Kenneth L. Krebs wrote, "We buried more than a soldier that day. We buried the idea of hatred." A single tragedy, recorded in sterile government language, revealed the beating heart of an unlikely peace. When Germany finally collapsed in May 1945, the men inside Camp Aliceville had already changed. Weeks before official surrender, radio bulletins filtered through the loudspeakers. Berlin encircled, Hitler dead, the Reich disintegrating. The reaction, as recorded in Provost Marshal General Psychological Report B4, was silence, no cheers, no defiance, only disbelief. For soldiers who once believed the war machine eternal, the fences of Alabama had become more stable than the nation they left behind. Interrogation transcripts from the U.S. Army G2 files W9871 show the shock vividly. One former Panzer sergeant admitted, "I thought Americans were weak. They beat us with engines and with decency." Another officer told his examiner, "Here I saw order without fear. It will be hard to return." These statements were later forwarded to intelligence analysts who noted that humane captivity had achieved what propaganda never could. Ideological erosion. German headquarters viewed such transformation with alarm. Captured documents from BAMA RW 6514 contained directives warning POW camps in occupied territories that fraternization undermines faith in victory. But in the United States, exactly that fraternization became policy. Friendship, it turned out, was the ultimate counterweapon. Discipline statistics confirmed the shift. Aliceville's records show disciplinary incidents fell by 78% between January 1944 and January 1945. Red Cross inspectors wrote simply, "Spirit excellent." The guards no longer feared revolt. Prisoners no longer feared guards. Instead, they shared cigarettes, played chess, and discussed post-war Europe across picnic tables built in the workshop. To the men who had once marched behind Rommel's banners, the enemy's true power was now undeniable. The rifles and fences remained, but the Americans had conquered something deeper, the mind. When repatriation orders arrived that summer, many POWs wept. They had come to a strange country expecting vengeance and were leaving with respect. One wrote in his farewell letter, preserved in the Eisenhower Library POW file, MAF 4122, "The United States has defeated Germany, but it has also defeated hate." By the summer of 1945, victory had redrawn every border, but the quiet triumph inside America's POW camps carried an influence far beyond fences. As Operation Homeward began, more than 370,000 German prisoners were processed for repatriation under the supervision of the Provost Marshal General's office. At Camp Aliceville, departing men lined up with packed duffel bags and tears in their eyes. The Eisenhower Library's POW letters file, about 4112, preserves dozens of farewell notes. "You treated us as men," wrote one former artilleryman. "We returned to ruins, but with respect for America." American intelligence officers quickly realized this goodwill had strategic value. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's Morale Division report, 1946, concluded that humane treatment in U.S. camps contributed measurably to the post-war democratic orientation of returning POWs. Many would later help rebuild West Germany's institutions. Some even returned to America as immigrants, teachers or farmers. Domestically, the impact was tangible. Agricultural reports credited POW labor with saving millions of dollars in crops and infrastructure during labor shortages. The Aliceville Post-Register, April 1947, printed photographs of returning Germans visiting the camp and embracing their former guards. Locals who once feared Nazi prisoners now referred to them as the polite workers who fixed our fences. Red Cross archives confirm that no major disturbances occurred during repatriation, a logistical miracle given the scale. Officials cited morale, mutual respect, and the consistent enforcement of Geneva standards as key reasons. Even skeptical officers admitted the policy of decency had yielded measurable security dividends, fewer escapes, higher productivity, and enduring goodwill. For many Americans, these memories redefined the meaning of victory. It wasn't just the fall of Berlin, it was the sight of former enemies shaking hands in an Alabama field. The war had forged iron weapons, but in its aftermath, compassion proved the stronger steel. Historians now regard America's WW2 POW program as one of the most successful humanitarian military operations in modern history. What began as an untested policy rooted in the 1929 Geneva Convention evolved into a blueprint for moral warfare, a doctrine proving that dignity could accomplish what intimidation never could. In post-war analyses, scholars such as Dr. Arnold, Kramer and Glenn Fiedler emphasize that U.S. camp policies became the prototype for later Cold War and Vietnam era prisoner handling standards at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. The case study, Camp Aliceville, Decency as Deterrence, remains part of the ethics curriculum. It concludes that humane treatment was not sentimentality, but strategy. Each act of fairness destabilized Nazi ideology and cultivated democratic sympathies long before Germany's official surrender. The 1955 Army Field Manual 2710, directly influenced by wartime lessons, codified these principles, mandating that all prisoners be treated as potential partners in peace. Aliceville's murals, letters, and artifacts, many preserved at the Aliceville Museum and the Smithsonian Institution's Human Studies program, stand as physical testaments to that philosophy. Visitors still read diary entries describing the day Americans and Germans buried a comrade together. To modern military historians, these details represent more than goodwill. They mark a turning point in the global understanding of lawful warfare. Sociological studies conducted by the Smithsonian in 2011 found that local residents viewed the camp years as our first experience with international cooperation. Elderly townspeople remembered learning phrases of German from the POWs who repaired their barns or helped harvest cotton. Those recollections mirror broader national surveys showing how the POW program softened American attitudes toward post-war reconciliation. Even German post-war culture bore the imprint. Several former prisoners published memoirs praising American fairness. A few became prominent educators and politicians in the new Federal Republic. The quiet lessons of Aliceville influenced how a defeated people rebuilt democratic institutions from the ground up. Across decades, the legacy remains clear. The most profound victory the United States achieved inside its borders during World War II was not military, it was moral. Aliceville proved that compassion, applied with discipline, could rewrite the psychology of an enemy and endure as a living standard for future generations of soldiers. By the time the gates of Camp Aliceville swung open for the last time in 1946, the war was over, but a different victory had been won. The Provost Marshal General's final report summarized it in one unassuming line. The United States treated prisoners not as they were, but as they might become. That single sentence captured the essence of America's moral experiment, a triumph of principle over vengeance, and of law over rage. Within those fences, humanity had become strategy. Every fair ration, every shared cigarette, every note of Beethoven echoing through the Alabama heat had worked like quiet propaganda for democracy. What started as necessity became revelation, that even in war, mercy could be a weapon. Guards and prisoners who once faced each other through guns ended up exchanging addresses, letters, and later, family photographs. The story of Aliceville and hundreds of camps like it is more than a wartime footnote. It is a living demonstration that American ideals hold their power even in the darkest circumstances. When the world expected brutality, the United States answered with restraint. When ideology demanded hatred, it replied with law. Those choices echoed across continents, shaping both the post-war order and the moral credibility of a superpower emerging from conflict. Today, historians, soldiers, and citizens alike can still visit the small Alabama museum that preserves those murals, letters, and diaries. They remain reminders that leadership is not only about victory, but about virtue in victory. To anyone studying the balance between force and conscience, the lesson is clear. Nations are remembered not for the wars they win, but for the humanity they preserve while winning them. Military history proves it beyond doubt. America's greatest strength has never been its weapons, but its mercy,